we flew on this little tiny four-seater airplane into Kabul. And we walk out of the airport into the city, and it's all destroyed, no power. We walk through this long avenue, and one side was this tank graveyard, and on the other side, all these, airplane war jets. And finally, when we come out on the main square, they're there. The Taliban was there waiting for us.
Jesus never promised his followers an easy path. In fact, he told his disciples that the world would hate them. He sent them out as sheep among wolves. Jesus' words came true in the life of the apostles, and they're still coming true today in the lives of his followers around the world. Join host Todd Nettleton as we hear their inspiring stories and learn how we can help. Right now on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio Network.
Welcome again to the Voice of the Martyrs Radio. My name is Todd Nettleton, and we are in the studio this week in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, with another of our one-name guests. We are simply going to call him Brother Matthew. Brother Matthew is a gospel worker in Central Asia, and we will talk about some of the wheres that he has been. He has known some of our previous Voice of the Martyrs Radio guests, and we may talk a little bit about that too. But Brother Matthew, welcome to the Voice of the Martyrs Radio.
It's good to be with you today.
As we go back now decades to the time that God got a hold of your heart for missions, for the world, for the lost, Tell me about how that happened, about how God opened your eyes, because Central Asia is a long way from here.
Yeah, I, first of all, grew up not in a Christian family, not in a Christian home. Very difficult teenagehood and partying hard and being out mixed with all kinds of difficulties and drugs and things like that. And one day, I was 18 years old. Something radical happened in my life. Basically, my mom, who wasn't a Christian herself, decided to take me to church. And she said, enough is enough. Let's get this going. And both her and I, that Sunday, were on our knees giving our lives to Jesus. Wow. And obviously, everything changed afterwards. And as I read through the Bible, for the very first time in my life, I remember reading through the book of Acts and how that whole experience that the apostles had with the reality of God in expanding the church, in living by faith, even without now having physically Jesus in front of them, but just having to conquer with him in faith, the expansion of the church, that began to really speak to my heart. We begin to see what God is doing through the Apostle Paul. Later on in chapter 26 of the book of Acts, Paul had been arrested and he was in front of King Agrippa. He's telling the king, as he's being judged in court, he's telling the king his whole story and how he had had an encounter with Jesus. And Jesus invited him to go to the Gentiles and to bring them from darkness to God's wonderful light. And I was struck by that. First, by the word Gentiles. I understand in that context who were the Gentiles to the Jewish people, but I began to meditate and think about who are those who are far from faith today in my generation. And I looked around where I lived, and there was a church in every corner. And I began to ask God, who are these people? They're totally ostracized, far from you. But one thing that really struck me, Todd, was like in verse 19 of chapter 26, after Paul had shared all that to the king, he says this, and I could not be disobedient to that heavenly vision. And as Paul was telling the king that in court, it really struck my heart that I really needed to do something about that. And I began to ask the Lord for the next couple of years, Lord, who are the Gentiles of my generation? Who are those far? And I went on a journey of just seeking God and praying and praying. And 2 years down the road, I was then already serving as a young missionary. I joined a youth missions organization, and I began to do street evangelism, and I was serving, and I had been serving in my church, and I was serving through this organization. And 2 years later, as I had been praying, asking God about who are these unreached peoples that are far. In prayer, I believe the Lord highlighted a people and a nation to me that was completely out of my imagination in those days. As I was praying, I began to see images of a TV news show that I watched with my parents in the early 80s of the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan. That began to come back to my mind so vividly many years later. This was now 1997. And all these faces of Afghans began to reel through my mind, and I really began to feel the Holy Spirit bringing my heart to that nation, and to begin to ask God for that nation. And I asked the Lord, is this the nation? Is this the people that you want me to go to bring the gospel? And I really felt that warm and peaceful yes. I had been asking, I had been seeking, and that was enough to really just make me move. I went back to my church and spoke to my pastor, and I think that was the biggest confirmation I had. He looked at me and said, I believe that you were made for this.
Wow.
I believe that you were called to be in a place that is so far, and we will stand with you 100%. And my mom obviously was in shock. It was a very difficult process of understanding a calling, for her son. But she blessed me without knowing much. She said, if that is what you need to do, that is what you need to do. I bless you.
Wow.
And she did. She took me to the airport 6 months later and saw me off going out and moving to Central Asia. Through that missions organization I was involved with, I had found out of a group that was doing church planting in Uzbekistan that I could join. And in those days, obviously the Taliban was ruling Afghanistan, and just jumping right into Afghanistan wasn't something simple at all, wasn't something that was doable. And I was 23 years old. I had so much to learn, and I learned about this work across the border in Uzbekistan. And I believe that, I was supposed to join them and learn, for a good 2 years what it meant to do ministry, to do church planting in Afghanistan or in Central Asia at all. So I moved there and I joined this team, and it was an incredible, incredible opportunity to learn, and the things I witnessed in those days, right? So this is now 1998. Soviet Union had left only 6 years prior, really 6.5 years before. And as I arrived there, we're seeing some of the very first churches in the history of that nation, emerging. And, we were meeting people that literally had supernatural encounters with Jesus, like this young lady. She was from a village in Uzbekistan, and she had grown up as a teenage girl teaching the Quran to the girls in her village. And the reason she did that is because when she was 8 years old, many years before, she had had a vision of a man in white in her house. And she came to her aunt and told her about that. And her aunt, being a very traditional, spiritually respected lady in her village, but a Muslim, she told her, you must have been chosen by God to teach the Quran. So she starts teaching the Quran to all these girls in her village for many years, up until when she's 17. And when she's 17 years old, she became very depressed through many, many situations in her life. She one day decided to commit suicide. And she tried to take her life. And she drank this very strong poison, and she was supposed to have died, except she wakes up in the morning in the hospital with that same man in white that she had seen as a little girl, pulling her arm and saying, come back to life, come back to life. And she wakes up and she's completely well, she's completely healed. And now she feels like she needs to really learn about who that man is.
Did the lady, her aunt, suggest who it would have been? Like it would have been Muhammad, or she just said, you must have been chosen to be a teacher?
She believed it was a visitation from God somehow. She knew somehow that was a very holy thing that had happened to her. So I come across this girl now in the capital of Uzbekistan a couple of years after she had had this experience. And she would tell the story that she met a missionary who was able to explain to her who that man in white was. And when she learned it was Jesus, he showed her the Jesus film, and she got that Jesus film and went back to her village and showed to all the girls that she had taught the Quran, and they all watched who Jesus was and who God was, and it was an amazing experience that she had. And so these were the people that I was coming across as the book of Acts was being written right in front of our eyes in those days in Central Asia.
Wow. We're talking this week on Voice of the Martyrs Radio with Brother Matthew. He is a gospel worker in Central Asia. Matthew, I want to ask you, when you felt that call to Afghan people and you moved, halfway around the world to start answering that call, how did you think about danger or risk? I mean, obviously the war had just ended, or as far as the Soviet and Afghanistan war. How did you think about being a Christian in a very Muslim environment, in a very violent environment? Did you have to kind of have an altar experience where you said, hey, if I die, I die? Or did God kind of take that fear away? Or
I did know that it was not an easy part of the world at all. And I knew after I began to study a little bit about the country what the Taliban was capable of doing. I learned about what they had already done by conquering Afghanistan and how they had done it. So I was somewhat aware that, it was a very hostile situation that I was going into. So I began to look for other missionaries that had been involved with that nation. Obviously, there were not many at all. But through my organization, I was able to refer back to a few people that had been there, that had lived there, that knew who the real Afghan people were. And the situation, the brokenness of Afghanistan as a nation was, to me back then, very moving. Afghans were in extreme poverty in those days. They had been, especially in the north of the country, under a drought for 5 years. People had absolutely no water, no food. And that whole situation really broke my heart. But also learning from other missionaries, the Afghans, they're actually some of the most friendly people in the world. And though we don't see this at all through the media, they will literally lay down on the floor for you to step on if you need them to survive, if you need them for help. I began to listen to some of those stories and obviously seeing that where else in the world does the gospel need to go? There are so many unreached nations that they're unreached until now for a reason. But how long more will it take? Right, so all this was going through my mind, and the danger began to somehow become overwhelmed by the possibility of seeing an Afghan church emerging. That was what I was really trusting God for in those days.
Amen. So how did God help you to make the transition from Uzbekistan, getting your feet wet, to Afghanistan, the place that he called you?
In those days, the border between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan was closed. And I learned that in order for me to actually enter Afghanistan, I would have to go to Pakistan, to the border town of Peshawar, and visit the Taliban consulate in order to get a visa. So I go into Peshawar and I meet different people, some of whom were connected to our organization. And I'm about now to have to go get a visa from the Taliban office. And people introduced me to a translator. And this translator is supposed, obviously, to help me get myself understood to the Taliban in order to get a visa. Except that this translator didn't know much what I was going to do in Afghanistan. So I arrived to the Taliban consulate. What I remember is as I opened the door, it's this empty room, and at the very end of the room, there's a desk, and right behind the desk, there's this man sitting with a very big turban on his head, with a very long black beard, dressed on these long white clothes. And as I began to walk through the door, he doesn't look at me directly. He turns his face, and he's only looking at my translator, and he's only saying salam to my translator. And I was shocked because in the local culture, they will always greet you and say salam to you. They're very hospitable and welcoming, but that wasn't the case. So obviously, as I was going into that situation, I was frightened, and as I sit down at the chair in front of him, in front of his desk, he's still not looking at me. He's only speaking to my translator, and he goes on for about 20 minutes talking to my translator. And I'm thinking, what is this guy telling him? He has no idea what I'm going to do. He doesn't really know me well. Well, after about 20 minutes, this Taliban man turns to me in perfect English and says, well, if you tell me everything that he's just told me about what you're going to do in Afghanistan, I'll give you the visa. I was panicking, and I began to tell him, I want to go in, I want to help your country, I want to go in to serve, and blah, blah, blah. And I began to say many things. And at the very end, he looks at me and says, okay, come back at 3 p.m., you get your visa. And I opened my eyes, and I couldn't believe it. It's just giving me a visa. And my translator's looking at me, and we walk out the door, and my translator looks at me and says, do you speak Pashto? I said, no, because you said word by word everything that I told him. I'm like, wow, thank you, God. It was a very, very intimidating experience, to say the least. But definitely God came through and helped me.
But what an affirmation. I'm the one who called you here, and I will open the door when it needs to be opened. You don't have to worry.
It truly was. It felt that way. It really was a God intervention and him opening the doors.
Wow.
Yeah.
We're talking this week on Voice of the Martyrs Radio with Brother Matthew. He is a gospel worker in Central Asia. What did you find when you got to Afghanistan as a Christian, as a foreigner, as somebody who wants to see the seeds of the gospel planted? What was the soil like when you got there?
I learned then that, there were 5 Afghan believers, the missionaries knew about in the whole nation. Those 5, they would go to the bazaar and buy groceries. One would, get some potatoes. The other would reach for some tomatoes. And while they were near each other, one would whisper a Bible verse to the other. The other would whisper back a prayer. And that was church.
Wow.
In those days, the Taliban just imagined that they were there as believers. Obviously, that would end their lives. But that was the existence of the church in Afghanistan by then.
Wow. I'm sorry, I'm just floored by the 5 believers in a whole country. I mean, and the good news is everyone you talk to needs to hear about Jesus. As a gospel worker, as a missionary, how do you start from zero?
Right.
And think about, okay, we want to plant a church. We want the gospel to grow here.
Mm-hmm.
What are the first steps? Like, how do you get the ball rolling?
After I arrived to Kabul, I got on an old Land Cruiser with an Afghan pilot, and we went over the mountains. And we drive through all these ghost villages, these ghost towns that, they were completely empty, either because the Taliban had come through killing everyone that opposed them, or because they had left and become refugees in other nations nearby. But it was a very difficult picture. It was quite overwhelming looking at all that, even looking back now. But I went up all the way to the other side of the country, over the mountains, and as I got there, I began to get to know what things were like. So I began to visit all the villages that were in that part, in the province, specific province that I was hoping to live in and begin to reach. So I go from one village to the other, and I come across this one small village that had about 3,000 people. And as I arrived there, I had been visiting many villages, and I arrived there, all the people come out and, desperate for help. And this one man, especially, he comes running towards me, and he had this little baby in his hands who had been born maybe a couple days before, prematurely, very small, very sick, the baby was. And his dad is looking at me and saying, "Please help me. Please help me." I'm struck by that picture. Everybody's faces looked like they hadn't bathed for probably a year. There was no water whatsoever in that village. I learned that everybody was not able to read and write. They're not literate. People before them had never been to school before. Their generations before them had never been educated. And not only that, but as I look at that baby, I look at his dad and I ask him, "What can I do to help? I'm not a doctor, but what are you giving this baby?" And I begin to ask what they're doing. And he says, "Well, this is all I can give him." And he opens the baby's little mouth and he pulls this black paste from the baby's gum. And I look at it and I'm shocked. And I look at everybody around looking at me, all the locals. I kind of knew what it was, but I asked to everybody, "Is this opium?" And everybody's like, yes, this is opium. And I learned that everybody in that village was addicted to opium. And it was something cultural. It was something they
gave to their babies.
They gave to their babies.
Wow.
So the babies wouldn't cry. So I learned that baby died 3 days later, and the Lord had my heart in that place. And I started there. Now I'm fast forwarding, a few months. I found 2 other young men that came join me. And the 3 of us now, guys, we were beginning to work with that village. And what we felt that we could do in those days was to gather all the men and begin to work together to build a school. Like I said, nobody knew how to read and write. And we felt, let's start with a school. And that would give us a place to simply relate to the people and bring them to some sort of growth and development. So we gathered all the men in the village, and we said, what if we built a school together? And they were so excited. We said, we're going to make all the bricks. We had enough money only to buy the beams, the wooden beams that would go on the roof. But basically they said, yeah, we'll make all the bricks and we'll work together. So we made hundreds of thousands of bricks. In the end, they were like, "But this is a school just for boys, right?" We said, no, this is for boys and girls. Your girls have to go to school the same way that your boys, because, they're just as able and they need to rise up. And they went into a bit of a conflict in their minds with the whole idea of girls being educated. But later on, they agreed to it. And so we went forward and we finished building the school. That was 11 classrooms. We brought teachers from, other parts of the province to help, and connected with the local government there. And suddenly all these little kids are going to school in uniforms. Most of those kids have graduated high school now, and many went to college, and we keep hearing about them. So it was an amazing entering experience. I didn't know necessarily what we were doing, but one step after the other, God was faithful to show us what to do.
We've been talking with Brother Matthew here on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio. He is a gospel worker in Central Asia, and he's been telling us how God gave him a love and a calling for the people of Afghanistan. I hope your heart has been moved and that you'll pray this week for people in Afghanistan and all over Central Asia. You can find other programs in our archives that will help you learn more about this region of the world. To hear those, go to our website, vomradio.net, or look for Voice of the Martyrs Radio wherever you listen to podcasts. We didn't have time this week for my complete conversation with Brother Matthew, so he's going to be back with us next week. If you've ever felt a tug on your heart to get involved with missions, I hope you'll make sure that you're back for the second half of this conversation. Brother Matthew is going to help you identify some possible next steps that you can take. You'll want to be part of that conversation next week right here on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio Network.